Hello, everybody. It's nice to see you all, and welcome to the Havighurst Center lecture series, which this semester focus on laughter. It's called Authoritarian Laughter from a Joke to a Revolution. And our speaker today will be Dr. Stephen Norris. So I have to just say a few more things before we start. So the lecture series are sponsored by the Havighurst Center, and Dr. Stephen Norris is the director, so is somehow involved in that as well. So thanks to him. And thank you to Lynn Stevens, who always helps to administer and organize the series. So let me introduce our speaker for today, Dr. Norris. He is the Walter Havighurst Professor of Russian History and the director of the Havighurst Center for Russian and Post-Soviet Studies. His research focuses on modern Russian history with an emphasis on visual culture and propaganda since the 19th century. He is the author of two books, A War of Images, Russian Popular Prints, Wartime Culture, National Identity from 1812 to 1945, and Blockbuster History in the New Russia, Movies, Memory, Patriotism, and he is currently working on a biography of the most significant Soviet political caricaturist, Boris Euphemoth, and I think we will hear about this today as well, entitled Communism's Cartoonist, Boris Euphemoth and the Soviet Century. Norris has also edited or co-edited 6 books. His Museums of Communism, New Memory Sites in Central and Eastern Europe, just came out in 2012, and I'm lucky to have a copy. His co-edited book with Yelena Baraban, The Kunin Project, The Histories and Mysteries of Russia's best-selling author, will appear in 2021 with the University of Toronto Press. In 2018, along with Eugene Avrutin, Norris created the Russian Shorts series with Bloomsbury Press. The first 2 books appeared in 2020, with 13 more under contract, including Norris's book on the history painters Vasily Surikov and Viktor Vaznetsov. So, Steve, I must apologize. The title of your lecture is, if you could
Sharing right now.
Yes, excellent. So thank you very much for joining the colloquium, and we are looking forward to hearing about Yefimov and your amazing research.
Thank you, Neringa. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Good to see lots of familiar names and a couple faces for those who have their cameras on, and some colleagues who I haven't seen very much of late, Vinland Ganev in particular. Dan Pryor also here, and even Bruce Grant, the first lecturer of the series, is here. So I really appreciate it. I also should note that Dr. Klumbite has an article in that Museums of Communism books. So I did not force her to buy it. She got it for free as well, but she probably would have bought it anyway.
I would have bought it anyway.
Right. Well, so as you can see, the title of the lecture is The Weapon of Laughter. And you can also see on your screen a 1936 poster made by the famous, even already at that time, political caricaturist Boris Yefimov, invoking Stalin's infamous 1935 speech that life is getting better, life is getting more joyous. And you can see in this image that there are Soviet citizens smiling, laughing, in part because they are reading Stalin's words in Pravda, and also because they can compare themselves to Hitler, who is not getting more joyous. The text says, "I'm sad because you are happy." And the image alludes to one of the major themes of this talk today. Here's a visualization of how good citizens can look at something or read something and laugh, and in laughing and mocking an enemy, they can belong to the Soviet collective. The talk then will proceed with 5 episodes. The first covers how Bolshevik theorists and political satirists conceived of laughter as a weapon, and how the journal Crocodile came to serve as the main weapons storage facility in the attempt to use satire and the laughter it provoked as a means to create new citizens. Sort of thinking about that first image there. The second part introduces us to the most prolific political caricaturist that Dr. Klumbite also referenced, Boris Yefimov, the creator of that first image, and the arsenal he employed from 1917 to 1991, because he did work from 1917 to 1991, and including his work for Crocodile. We'll get a glimpse in the second part into how his cartoons created a form of participatory propaganda, where Soviet viewers were encouraged to respond to their messages. You could see that in that opening image too. Our third episode then delves into 3 episodes from Euphemoth's career, examples of his work and the reactions they provoked, before turning to the 4th episode, revealing how the letters sent to Boris Euphemoth, especially in the late Soviet period, changed in tone and reforged the participation of viewers. And finally, I'll end by going back to Crocodile in general and how the magazine itself evolved, allowing us to reach some conclusions, I hope, about the nature of Soviet political caricatures, about Soviet satire, and Soviet propaganda. So to begin, the weapon of laughter. The Soviet state and important officials, along with artists, attempted to harness satire as a weapon, to shape humor, and with it, to use satire and the laughter it should provoke to forge new citizens, the Soviet experiment born in 1917 hoped to create. Or put another way, the Soviet state and its satirists sought to fashion a Soviet laughter and a Soviet viewer. If you looked at a political caricaturist or read a pointed satirical article and you laughed, you were the right kind of person, so the thinking went, and in doing so, you were becoming Soviet. The major weapons facility in this attempt to create a Soviet laughter and with it a Soviet person was the journal Crocodile, founded in 1922. And as the scholar John Eddy has written, the journal was genuinely popular, with 6 million subscribers by the 1970s, which is itself a very interesting thing. Crocodile was therefore easily the most significant, widely distributed official source of Soviet satire, offering an approved buffet of poems, short articles, and cartoons, thinking, as we heard earlier in the lecture series, about satire as a buffet. You are seeing on your screen here the first ever issue from 1922 and the last issue of Crocodile produced as a Soviet journal from December 1991. Crocodiles, we'll hear at the end, actually survived the collapse of the Soviet Union and went through an overhaul after the Soviet Union collapsed. Crocodile was the first of many Soviet satirical journals in other Soviet republics, all with suggestive names. Pepper in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, Hedgehog in the Belarusian Soviet Socialist Republic, Fist in Uzbekistan, Broom in Lithuanian, which we'll hear about over the course of this semester, the magazine Broom, and Dr. Klumbite is the world's leading expert on Broom. And others included names such as Bumblebee, Nettle, Wasp, and Scorpion. Crocodile in these journals existed, as that sort of overview of the titles alluded to, within a wider visual world in the Soviet Union. Newspaper caricatures in Pravda and Izvestia, the 2 major papers in the Soviet Union. Other journals published images and satirical articles such as Ogonyok, another very influential journal, posters such as the one I began with, and so on and so forth. And here too, satire in both its visual and textual expressions was part of a larger world in turn of Soviet propaganda, which aimed to explain the world, flatten it, make it easier to understand, and foster a particular truth. Soviet propaganda evolved, I think, more than is often understood, and was much more dynamic than is also often understood. It was didactic, to be sure, from the beginning to the end, but often more nuanced and entertaining in some of its forms than is often acknowledged. It was a system, in other words, that is Soviet propaganda, and the way Crocodile functioned within it, that needs to be studied as such, and I'll kind of think us through that a bit today. The Soviet Union was definitely a propaganda state in one form from beginning to end, to extend a classic term introduced by Peter Kennitz, a historian. But it wasn't the same propaganda state from beginning to end. And these 2 issues, I think, provide a glimpse into that. They're quite different in their tone and their tenor. Crocodile also employed, to focus on it a little more, a host of caricaturists, and writers too for that matter, who offered a buffet of cartoons. Its basic function was to foster a healthy helping of laughter through a buffet of satirical offerings, And you can see it powerfully captured in this cartoon from 1925 by Konstantin Rotov, featuring other satirists, all men, as you can see. The table includes Dmitry Mor, Mikhail Cheryomnych, and Victor Denis, who were all seen as like the founding fathers or elder statesmen of Soviet satire. But also you can see at the table a new generation of satirists created by 1917, including Rotov, the artist who did this. Lev Brodati is here, Yuri Gamf is here, the trio known as the Kukreniksi are here, and Boris Euphemoth, as someone will learn about more. The ranks at this table will be added to over the years, but the last group, that group created by 1917, including Euphemoth, had remarkable staying power at the table of Soviet satire. What did this buffet taste like? Well, as Annie Guerin has written in a recent book about Soviet satire, official Soviet satire tried to evoke fear, anger, contempt, distress, disgust, interest, shame, and occasionally joy or amusement. The idea of Soviet satire, at least as its theorists offered, was that laughter was envisioned as a weapon in the struggle to build socialism. And if you laughed at Soviet satire, you could effectively first identify problems and enemies, and then destroy them and other threats to the Soviet state by ridiculing them on the page, and then by good people laughing at them at home. This is the basis for what I referred to earlier as participatory propaganda, at least from the point of view of the Soviet state. The thinking behind this idea of laughter as a weapon emerged out of 19th century Russian satirical traditions, even earlier Russian satirical traditions, and also from the explosion of satirical journals from 1905 to 1912 in the Russian Empire. We heard a little bit about one of them in the Caucasus earlier in this lecture series, and we'll hear maybe more about them too. The idea of these traditions was to expose enemies, to mock them, and in doing so, to deflate them. Many Bolsheviks, and primarily Anatoly Lunacharsky among them, who was the first Commissar of Enlightenment in the Soviet government, theorized that laughter and satire within a socialist state could kill, with quotes, strike, hit targets. And as Commissar of Enlightenment, Lunacharsky attempted to implement this idea. And as Annie Guerin writes, laughter, at least as Lunacharsky saw it, was a weapon and a tool. It could destroy the outmoded, the residual, and the deviant, the old, in other words, in order to create something new. We might see these notions here in the two examples I've put on the screen from 1924 and 1925. On the left, even leaders could be mocked a little bit, brought down to earth, reminded that even communists could dance, as the text states. And Lunacharsky himself, the primary theorist of laughter as a weapon, is the person dancing with the crocodile in this image on the left. On the right is a meta image, really. This is the new imagined person coming into being. The text says, I read crocodile, and he's laughing and therefore becoming Soviet. He's doing the right thing asked of him. One final note, at least in this regard, the weapon, as all weapons, I suppose, needed to be sharpened from time to time. In 1927, for example, the Central Committee of the Communist Party issued a decree called On the Humoristic Satirical Presses. Soviet decrees always have something quite boring like that. On the Humoristic Satirical Presses, which claim that the majority of publications, even Crocodile, were not up to snuff. They were still too inscrutable at times. They did not reach enough targets, did not hit them as accurately as they could. So the call in the wake of this decree was for satirists to be better, clearer. In 1948, for example, another instance from this long history of sharpening the weapon, Crocodile would come again under criticism and be revamped, expanded, and improved. Many fighters, even satirical fighters, wondered aloud whether a Soviet state should even have satire after a certain point. Mikhail Koltsov, a journalist and editor, pointed out in 1929, for example, that satire had always been oppositionary against governments. So he asked rhetorically, in a Soviet country, who could satirists aim at? Themselves? So this ongoing dialogue is part of the evolution of Soviet propaganda I mentioned earlier, here focused on satire. It had crisis moments, but it continued to sharpen itself. And Crocodile itself would remain and even flourish after these attempts to critique it. It did so in part because it always maintained a sharp weaponry, a steady group of satirical soldiers, and focused targets. It also evolved in the wake of discussions, expanding its weaponry and those who wielded it, establishing a dominant form of participatory propaganda. Among other ways this participatory propaganda functioned was the magazine asked for letters to the editor, published them, even asked viewers to suggest cartoon topics, and then would have famous artists draw them. And so you'd see them appear in Crocodile, a cartoon of Boris Euphemoth from a theme of Ivan Ivanov from Ivanova, for example. And here is a good example, now you can see the image that's behind me, of how Crocodile maintained its didactic function and its participatory function at the same time. A two-page 1967 spread about an exhibit dedicated to 50 years of reading and learning. So 1967, of course, the 50-year anniversary of the revolutions in 1917. Crocodile had special issues dedicated to this 50-year anniversary. Here's one about satire and publishing. And you can see people coming out in the bottom of the humor and satire room and laughing. Once again, the healthy laughter of a good Soviet citizen. The fact this was in Crocodile was also reminding viewers this is what they should do when reading Crocodile. And this is how this magazine and other forms of satire aim to make a state viewer through a weapon of laughter. So let me turn now to one of the most important fighters in this struggle, Boris Euphemoth. Born in 1900, Boris Euphemoth was really born in 1917 when he changed his name to Euphemoth and when he joined the Bolshevik cause as a teenager and as a political caricaturist. In doing so, he launched the longest and most successful career in Soviet satire, visual propaganda, making him the steeliest warrior wielding the weapon of laughter and humor. Here you can see an early example of his work in Crocodile from 1922, the first year the journal existed, a cartoon called Proletarian Eye, where a Cheka worker, that is someone who associated with the secret police at the time, shines a light on Soviet enemies lurking in the dark, exposing the ugly yet ridiculous faces of spies, plotters, traitors, and others, while also providing the guide to eyeing them, how to look, how to view, how to see the world. Euphemoth offered perhaps the most sustained patterns in the history of Soviet propaganda, using his visual arsenal to create political caricatures that identified and ridiculed enemies, foreign enemies, but also personifications of capitalism, by contrasting the West with the Soviet state, by exposing the hidden machinations of Soviet enemies, by stressing the virtues of other right-minded allies. He was amazingly consistent in weaving a handful of patterns throughout his work from 1917 and 1991. And here you can see these pattern weaving exercises that Euphemoth engaged in. Enemies being identified and mocked, capitalism being personified, the revelation of the insidious hands of the West, comparing and contrasting the Soviet state with the capitalist West, is in the top right corner here. You don't have to read Russian to figure out who's the good person here and who's the bad person. And promoting fellow good people, the right-minded people who would also laugh the healthy laughter in the bottom here. The vast majority of Euphemoth's output could be slotted into these categories you see laid out here on this slide, making any event, any person seem familiar across time. And these examples, by the way, stretch from the 1920s all the way to the 1980s. Maybe if we could look in the top left, the Ideal Aryan cartoon, which was reprinted again and again and again, is particularly good. The Ideal Aryan, it says, should be tall, skinny, and blonde. And he's using Goebbels, Goering, and Hitler to contrast this. The Rapacious Hands of the West in the middle, where you see an American general in Vietnam now setting his sights on Cambodia, a particularly sharp example of the way Euphemoth's weapons worked. And of course, Euphemoth wielded his weapons in Crocodile. Here from Poincaré to Popravka Projekt, amending or correcting a law. This is the first ever on the left cartoon Boris Euphemoth published in this journal, Crocodile, in the first ever issue of Crocodile, making fun of Raymond Poincaré, the Prime Minister of France at the time. And on the right, you see his last ever crocodile cartoon from the 4th issue of 1991, the last year the Soviet Union existed. So literally from beginning to end of Crocodile, from beginning to end of the Soviet state, which was officially founded in 1922. I spent part of the summer, because we're all stuck at home, going through every issue of Crocodile to see how many cartoons Boris Euphemoth published in it. And the rough total I came up with is 1,225, which is one for every 3 weeks the Soviet Union existed, which means he was almost publishing one cartoon per issue. He published, and that was just one outlet for his work. He published at least 9,000 caricatures in his career, or one for every 3 days the Soviet Union existed. And he didn't just stop in 1991. This is his last cartoon for the journal Crocodile from 2001, mocking the web-like pull the internet had on people. He was 100 years old at this time, by the way, about to turn 101. Boris Euphemoth did not just wield his weapon via drawings, he wrote, becoming a particularly prolific writer after the 1961 Party Congress. One of his first writings you see here in the journal, at least, Questions of Literature, was called, no surprise maybe for those following along, The Weapons of Laughter, where he again stressed ideas going all the way back to Lunacharsky and applied to Soviet satire. Students read my translation of the article, so you've heard a little bit more about it. It's hard to overstate just how often someone, and even Euphemoth after 1961, would reaffirm the basic ideas that Soviet satire was a weapon, that it was special, that it was a weapon in a battle to build a better world, that it would provoke laughter and in turn belonging, all ideas captured in Euphemoth's article here. And, as Euphemoth wrote in this article too, that it had a deep special connection with Soviet people. There's that participatory element to it, at least as envisioned by people like Euphemoth. These notions could evolve. At the time Euphemoth wrote this, he was beginning to become engaged in the so-called battle for peace, where satire could be a weapon for peace. But the basic verbiage echoed across the Soviet century. Speaking of that verbiage, just one of numerous examples I could throw up here, the way that this language echoed across the Soviet century, particularly from people who wrote to Euphemoth, and he did get a lot of letters, and even more particularly from those whose letters were published to prove the point, such as this one from a group of frontline soldiers who demanded that Euphemoth continue to wield his weapon, strike at the enemies at the front, and they would continue to laugh because this helps them win the war in this case. And a second example of how another echoing of this language and the reverberations backwards, this time from one of the first books written about Boris Euphemoth and the meanings of his cartoons. It was already quite well known. 1952, an entire book he had already published collections of his cartoons before 1952. In fact, his first ever collection was published in 1924. But by 1952, he even had a short biography written about him. This is a quote from it that once again captures this repetitive language used about the weapon of satire and the meanings of his cartoons. It's remarkable, as I said, just how often these echoes resounded, tying satire, laughter, weapon together. And remarkable how often they were ascribed to Euphemoth or even written at times by Euphemoth. And you have to add that to the remarkable visual arsenal Boris Euphemoth wielded thousands of times from 1917 to 1991 to get a sense of his significance. So let's now see how this weapon was fired in 3 examples. Or if we want to run with the metaphor here, let's stand behind the bow, pull a string, fire an arrow, and see how it landed. So here are the first of 3 stories of Euphemoth's work and the meaning of them, 3 ways he wove those patterns and applied them to specific circumstances. This one is called On the Lithuanian Stage. It's from 1926, and it's about the coup d'etat that year in Lithuania, one where the Democratic Republic fell to the authoritarianism of Antanas Smetona and his party, the Lithuanian National Union, who came to power after a military coup staged on December 17th, 1926, allegedly to prevent what they thought was a Bolshevik coup scheduled for December 20th, 1926. So 3 days before this supposed Bolshevik coup in Lithuania, the Lithuanian National Union had a coup that brought Smetona to power. Depicted on the stage is the Lithuanian nationalist politician and one of the primary architects of this coup, Augustinus Voldemaras, who served as the country's prime minister after that coup. And the document in Voldemaras's hand says the sentence against the 4 communists have been carried out. Depicted on the left in the theater box are Josef Pilsudski, the first marshal and the authoritarian leader of Poland, who had also overseen a coup in 1926, and Sir Austen Chamberlain, the British Foreign Secretary. Pilsudski yells encore, Chamberlain yells bravo. In that event in December 1926, about 350 Lithuanian communists were arrested and 4 communist leaders were executed on December 26, 1926. So that's what you see reflected in this cartoon. And it fits within this notion that the West had its invisible hands everywhere, trying to get at the Soviet state, weaken it, maybe even causing it to collapse. Here you see them applauding with hands. Here you see the bloody hands of their puppet dripping from this action. On February 23rd, 1927, so just after this cartoon appeared, Sir Austen Chamberlain himself sent an official note to the Soviet government. He was irate, and he opened by characterizing the relationship between the 2 countries. Here, think bad British accent here, I won't give you one, as notoriously to be of an unsatisfactory nature. Chamberlain's official letter sent off a flurry of reactions that further soured relations between the United Kingdom and the Soviet Union. And it even led, this was the first act that led the UK to break off diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union later that year, now in 1927. In May 1927, after Chamberlain's note, which came just a few months after this cartoon, British police raided the headquarters of the Soviet Trade Commission in London and claimed that Soviet authorities had housed top secret stolen documents there. The conservative government of England, Soviet officials retorted in a response to all of this, are definitely taking their masks off. And the rupture in relations set off a war scare in the Soviet Union in 1927. Many people thought that the UK and the USSR were going to go to war. Back to his note from February, Chamberlain chastised Soviet officials for repeated public defamations against England. Back to imagining a stuffy British accent here. He deemed Soviet leaders in this letter as hostile and intemperate. And finally, he noted the notorious hostile attitude of the Soviet press toward Great Britain, citing several articles from Izvestia, the paper, as proof. And he ended his official letter sent to the Soviet government by singling out, quote, the grossly insulting and mendacious cartoon on the front page of the issue of the 29th of December, depicting the British Secretary of State, him that is, as applauding the execution of Lithuanian communists. So an official note that noted in the history of diplomacy, Boris Euphemoth's cartoon seen here. Chamberlain, as you could see a little bit in this image, was a caricaturist dream. I mean, this is from 1927. He looks every bit the British aristocrat. He's wearing his preferred monocle. He still wore monocles in the 1920s. I mean, who couldn't make fun of him? And his look proved irresistible even to British caricaturists. He regularly appeared as the object of satire in Punch and other publications. In fact, the British Cartoon Archive, maintained at the University of Kent, has over 200 caricatures from the 1920s depicting Chamberlain. He's routinely mocked, as he is here, for his stuffy appearance and stuffy politics. And Boris Euphemoth during the 1920s ridiculed Chamberlain no fewer than 50 times. So this is one of 50 cartoons that he published mocking Chamberlain and British foreign efforts or British foreign relations, helping to make Chamberlain into a routine and routinely mocked enemy of the Soviet state. So the back and forth captured in Chamberlain's letter and the response was part of this back and forth where Euphemoth was mocking him. And Euphemoth, when he became a writer, referred to this episode again and again and again in his memoirs. So here from his 2000 version of his memoirs, when he was about to turn 100, I want to tell you about Austen Chamberlain, and what I want to say about it, Euphemoth wrote, deserves to be recorded simultaneously in the history of caricature and in the history of international relations. And he said that Pilsudski, that is Euphemoth, arrogantly ignored the evil going on in Lithuania, but Lord Austen did not. And later in this memoir, Euphemoth bristled at the official letter that called the image deceitful, calling it, Euphemoth now responding well after the fact in 2000, calling Chamberlain's letter absolutely inapplicable in this case. After all, a caricature is not a photograph or a sketch from real life. It is conditional and metaphoric. And therefore, in Euphemoth's own words, this caricature is not false at all, but absolutely true. So here in this first episode of 3, an example of the Soviet caricature wielded by Boris Euphemoth striking the right target, at least from the Soviet point of view, and the weapon working. The next story was one of Euphemoth's favorite stories to tell about cartoons and his work within the Soviet state. In 1947, he received a call from Stalin's aide asking him to draw a cartoon that mocked American military forces arraying to protect the Arctic region from the Soviet threat. And the aide said when he called Euphemoth on the phone, Stalin remembered you, and he remembered you would be particularly apt for this job. And he was told, Euphemoth that is, from one of Stalin's aides, that he had 24 hours to complete a cartoon that mocked American military pretensions in the Arctic. And he worked feverishly, Euphemoth said, then submitted the following cartoon that you see here. This is the original draft housed in the Nebeltai archive in Prague. It's called Eisenhower's Defense Line. After expressing a desire to arm and defend the Arctic from the supposed Soviet threat, an American reporter, you can see here, asks Eisenhower, then still a general, what's going on? Why all the military activity? And Eisenhower responds, why? Can't you see the enemy forces here? It's here that we're facing a threat to our American borders. So mocking the notion that the Soviet Union was really a threat. In the recounting of this creation of this cartoon, and the way Euphemoth always referred to it, he got a call back from the same aide a day later saying, Stalin really liked this cartoon, but note that the Arctic does not have any penguins. You can see here. Penguins are only at the South Pole, not the North Pole. So Euphemoth corrected it, and here's the final version of the cartoon as it appeared in the press. Everything else is still the same. No penguins this time. When he recounted this story, and as I said, he did it a lot, Euphemoth would always end it with a serious note. And he would usually say something along the lines of, when I heard the words Stalin remembered you, I got scared, for it meant that the consequences could be severe, and to be remembered by Stalin was to be reminded of previous traumas. And in one sense, they were, of course, severe. Euphemoth's brother, Mikhail Koltsov, who himself was a satirist, I referenced him earlier, was arrested, tortured, and shot in the purges. But the consequences were also not quite as severe in the way Euphemoth told the story. Stalin rarely intervened in the making of political caricatures. This is one of, I think, 3 times in the history of Boris Euphemoth's work in the Soviet Union that Stalin had a direct response to a cartoon, and the only time that he was ordered to create a cartoon. Euphemoth's story and his reference to it again and again therefore turns the exception into the rule as a way of offering exculpatory evidence for his continued participation in creating Soviet propaganda. And in fact, from the so-called Stalin archives, this was more often the case. You can see an example here. Here's another example of Stalin in the rare instances where he corrected cartoons that were going to be published. Stalin, that is, on the right, has slightly altered the Kukryniksi's cartoon. That's a trio Euphemoth was friends with. The cartoon mocks James Forrestal's suicide in 1949. Forrestal was Secretary of Defense in the United States. He quit in March 1949 because of exhaustion and strain. He was hospitalized and he died by jumping out of his hospital window in May 1949. So the Soviets had a field day, Soviet caricaturists had a field day mocking Forrestal and the madness that he represented, which was also the madness of America. Here, however, you see from the Stalin archives, Euphemoth's cartoon and the Kukrynyksi cartoon that Stalin sent back to the Kukrynyksi. He wanted corrections on the Kukrynyksi's cartoon, and he actually said, Euphemoth's cartoon is better, clearer, use that as a model. So this was the way, in other words, that Stalin really remembered Boris Euphemoth. He was a model caricaturist. All right, our third story here of the 3 episodes. On Wednesday, January 27, 1965, the Soviet newspaper Izvestia, and here I should point out, Euphemoth was the principal political caricaturist for Izvestia. He was named to that position in 1922. He sort of semi-retired in the 80s, but he maintained his work for Izvestia and Crocodile, as I mentioned earlier, all the way to 1991. So he regularly published in Izvestia, in other words. So January 27, 1965, this was an untitled political cartoon that addressed nuclear proliferation in Europe. The cartoon was Euphemoth's, of course, the principal political caricaturist for the newspaper. You see several hands representing the members of the Warsaw Pact clamping down on a NATO nuclear missile. And Euphemoth's pithy text reads, "Put the multilateral nuclear scum in a vice." In the vice is a Polaris missile, an object that had become a regular feature of Euphemoth's work by the 1960s, with the hands of the Warsaw Pact countries clamping down on it, containing it, another prominent visual theme in his work, including hands of wartime allies from World War II, the US, the UK, and USSR clamping down on Nazis. So it was very much echoing previous work that Euphemoth had done. Here for a moment, since we're all on Zoom, I'm curious while you're all looking at this, for students and other people in the chat, if you're interested, post something about what you think of its meanings. Do you see anything interesting? Is it boring? Do you see anything worth critiquing? I'll get to that in a second. And I'll read maybe from it at the end. Can't do multiple things at once here. But nonetheless, if you're interested, post something. Do you see anything unusual? I use it as the third example here because in many ways it's a quintessentially typical Euphemoth cartoon, and therefore a very typical example of wielding the weapon of satire. Western machinations, this time in the form of nuclear proliferation, are still present in the world in 1965. They still need to be identified. They still need to be mocked. Yet the hands of Soviet friends, this time Warsaw Pact friends, could join together and stymie this latest attempt of the West. The weapon of satire, in other words, the healthy laugher it produced, could also remind viewers that the Soviet state had a handle on things. Part 4. Over the course of his career, Euphemoth received letters from Soviet viewers. As I mentioned earlier, the Crocodile and Izvestia, for that matter too, openly encouraged viewers, readers to write letters, and they would publish certain letters and viewers. Of course, they were heavily edited. Very few negative letters made it in. But nonetheless, people wrote extensively to Euphemoth, to Crocodile, to the newspaper. By the 1960s, Euphemoth began to receive increasingly negative letters, particularly after 1967. Here you see one of these letters addressed to Izvestia, the paper. So this is how you could do it. You write to Moscow, the headquarters is Izvestia, you put to who? Boris Euphemoth, and it got to him. Some of these letters talked about the trauma that Euphemoth referenced when talking about that Stalin Remembered You cartoon. So to sort of talk a little bit more about what the substance of that was, in December 1938, Euphemoth's older brother, the well-known journalist Mikhail Koltsov, was arrested during the purges. NKVD agents tortured him for months, and eventually Koltsov confessed to being a Trotskyite agent. And on February 2nd, 1940, an NKVD executioner shot Koltsov. Euphemoth successfully appealed to have his brother rehabilitated in 1954. And in fact, Sam Casper, a historian who got his PhD at the University of Pennsylvania, has written about rehabilitations and has seen in the archival record that Euphemoth's attempt to rehabilitate his brother acted as a model. Once Euphemoth was able to get Koltsov rehabilitated in 1954, others were able to reference it as the basis for their own appeals for rehabilitation. And beginning in 1961, when Euphemoth became a prolific writer, with the publication of his book, 40 Years, Notes of an Artist Caricaturist, Euphemoth cast his brother Koltsov as a pure hero, one who could inspire young Soviet citizens. And he reintroduced Mikhail Koltsov into Soviet public culture from 1961 onwards. Several letters written to Euphemoth in the 1960s and 70s made references to Koltsov, which is why I mentioned him. Many would write to him expressing sympathy, but the majority, at least of the letters I've seen, castigated him for selling out his brother by continuing to work for the state and or selling out Soviet Jews by supporting the Soviet state's anti-Zionist pronouncements. And that's why I said he got increasingly negative letters after 1967, after the war between Israel and the Arab states in 1967. Euphemoth and Koltsov, although they never publicly talked about it very much, were Jewish. Most people in the Soviet Union knew this. So by the 1960s, and especially the late 1960s, Euphemoth got a lot of negative letters about his Jewishness and the Soviet state's increasingly anti-Zionist tone. But back to that clamp. And if people posted in chat, we'll see if we You got anything? That cartoon provoked a lot of letters sent to Izvestia headquarters. And here's one in its entirety. Dear editors, out of feelings of goodwill toward your newspaper, I consider it absolutely necessary to give you my comments about an unsuccessful caricature printed in your newspaper on January 27th of that year. The caricature, despite the fact that its author is a recognized master, is unsuccessful in all respects. Moreover, it can even be read in the opposite meaning, which of course is undesirable. The problems are as follows. Number one, the text says in a vice, but it actually depicts tongs. And then in parentheses, this is not so important. Number two, the nuclear missile by design should be clamped, but in fact, it's not clamped at all and can fly freely. Number three, truly, as can be seen from the figure, we must understand, therefore, that the participants in the Warsaw Pact will not be able to hold the rocket with their hands clasped together on the handles. Now, the letter went on, it's not difficult to guess that a correctly conceived idea of a caricature, if executed incorrectly, provokes an undesirable opposite interpretation, namely, that because of the clash of interests in the Warsaw Pact countries, it will not be possible to put forward the adventurous plans for the creation of multilateral nuclear forces. Of course, I am far from thinking or suspecting the author of a deliberate distortion of meaning, but objectively it turns out that way. Therefore, the placement of such ambiguous cartoons in a leading central newspaper is certainly unacceptable. Reader, engineer, Bivel from Kramatorsk, Donetsk Oblast, Lenin Street, house and apartment named as well. That wasn't the only letter, that was the actual cartoon sent back by that engineer, pointing out the flaws. Another engineer from Perm noted the handles on the tongs should be spaced further apart and sent back to Izvestia a helpful correction with the words, this is better. That's what's on the right-hand side, pointing out how Euphemoth depicted it in the left. And the right, this is better. Another reader and another engineer named Natalia Sokolova from Leningrad also sent a letter that expressed how much she usually enjoyed Euphemoth's cartoons, but how deeply disappointed she was in this one from January 1965. This is her clipping of the cartoon from her paper. She drew on it also to indicate the flaw, same flaw, clamps aren't closed, nuclear weapons are gonna get out. Clearly, the Warsaw Pact countries can't contain it. Send it back to the paper. Interestingly, Euphemoth responded to these complaints. The language of those who sent back their cartoons was, at least in my reading, almost affected outrage. You know, far be it from me to say to a master that this is wrong, but I'm gonna say it. Euphemoth's replies back were almost over-the-top apologetics. To the first letter writer, the engineer from the Donetsk region, he claimed, quote, I indisputably allowed an unfortunate and unforgivable mistake in my work and thanked him for his reading attention. To engineer Sokolova in Leningrad, he sent the following reply. Dear Natalia Nikolaevna, your criticisms of my drawing in Izvestia are completely fair and correct. For my annoying oversights, I give to the readers of Izvestia, including to you personally, my most sincere apologies. The technical mistakes of the ill-fated caricature have already been fixed in a color poster that I made on the same topic. When this poster comes out, I'll send you a copy if you like. He did in fact make good on this promise and eventually sent her the following poster, one that corrected the major problem and the one that engineer Sokolova wrote back and thanked him for. And here's the poster. Still in a vice, but nonetheless, the weapon is clamped. And a point that ends this fourth episode. The participatory propaganda Euphemoth produced and that Crocodile and other Soviet publications promoted had interesting ramifications. You could write to Euphemoth and say you laughed healthy laughter. You could also write to him and say he was wrong and get him to correct it. What can we conclude about living in the satirical world? Which sounds very Madonna-like, you know. You can see here one of Boris Euphemoth's 1983 cartoons and see how his weapons eventually dulled. This is young Boris Euphemoth from 1922 accompanying old Boris Euphemoth from 1983 back on a journey in time, time to celebrate the 60th anniversary of Crocodile. Boris Euphemoth grew older, as you can see here. The state grew older, symbolized in 1983 by the Soviet gerontocracy, Brezhnev had just died at that point, but every member of that Soviet gerontocracy, which was widely mocked at home and abroad, was younger than Boris Euphemoth, who was 83 years old at this time when he drew this cartoon. The barbs, therefore, that he drew directed against enemies, capitalism, and invisible hands seem staler and staler. You can see that perhaps read into this cartoon, that aging process. The sharp weapon of satire that promised to produce healthy laughter and with it a new Soviet citizen seemed, frankly, like a tired caricature. And a sample here of the weapon as it dulled across time. Imagine you're a viewer who's seen the same thing again and again. 4 Euphemoth political caricatures from 1923 all the way to the 1980s, all depicting the Mad West, all similar, all recognizable. And in the end, in the 1980s, now the Mad West is allied with Mad China, all featuring the same stock caricatures. A mad American general dating back to Forrestal, and even before that, some sort of would-be Napoleonic figure, some sort of fascist revanchist, some sort of capitalist wearing the same striped pants, which they did not wear in the 1980s for those listening who were not alive in the 1980s. I didn't meet any capitalists in top hats and striped pants, but yet in the example from the 1980s, at the bottom, a top-hatted, well, he doesn't have his top hat, but his coat and his striped pants still there, still same clothes from the 1920s. A rendering of how the weapon dulled. And one more example of this kind, the front and back of the 10th issue of 1987. Boris Euphemoth had his cartoon published on the back of Crocodile, yet again warning about the West's nefarious schemes against the Soviet Union, even including the stock Soviet threat figure of the barbaric Bolshevik dating all the way back to the 1917 in one of his early cartoons. Although to be fair to Euphemoth, he's added Rambo, if you can just detect him here. And the cover, the long lines of bureaucracy drawn by a more up-and-coming cartoonist with the language of perestroika at the time. Welcome, we've already begun to answer your question. And you can see the poor Soviet citizen who wants to get something through the bureaucracy is going to have to wait a long, long time because the bureaucracy is so big at that time. Front and back exposing the way Crocodile didn't change and did change with the times. And meanwhile, even while Crocodile continued to offer Euphemoth's dishes on its buffet, it evolved in ways the political caricaturists did not. On the left, a panel of cartoons from 1990 in Crocodile from a special issue dedicated to the United States. And on the right, number 28 issue from 1991. Crocodile, the weapons storehouse, the repository of the weapon of laughter, diffused itself, and then the state collapsed. The satirical world created by Crocodile in 1922, one where the weapon of laughter could be fashioned and then mobilized, one where the right sort of person could be created from this arsenal, ultimately documented its sunset. That's what the right here is, the sunset of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. And ultimately could not compete, at least in part, with the Far Side. Those of you who have been looking at this might have guessed, this is a reprint of Gary Larson's Far Side cartoons, which were published in Crocodile in 1990, along with the kind of stale old Boris Euphemoth political caricatures. Crocodile, in some forms of its satirical weapons, in other words, its participatory propaganda, remained topical and popular. Its political caricatures seem staler. Euphemoth and Crocodile lived on. By 1999, as he neared his 100th birthday, this is what Euphemoth would have to say. Here, Euphemoth is spelling out the system of propaganda as he saw it, its reach, but also how sometimes Soviet propaganda, in his view, was correct and fair, and other times absurd, inhuman, as you could read. Propaganda in general, and the weapon of satire Boris Euphemoth specifically wielded, gave people something to believe in. It bound Soviet people together in a community, at least as he saw it. We might only need to add here, in this language you see from 1999, satirical weapons, provoking laughter, producing the healthy laugh of a Soviet citizen to close the circle I began. And of course, for those who read the article, the money shot from July 16, 2008, when I met and interviewed Boris Euphemoth, still alive, 107 years old. He signed a copy of one of his cartoons, in fact, one of the anti-Nazi cartoons. He would die a few months later in October 2008, just a few days after his 108th birthday. Interestingly, but not related, Crocodile also finished its last revised run that same year, 2008. All right, thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Dr. Norris. This is just an amazing material. So monumental, 100 years, one person, and all Soviet history. It's fantastic, and we will be looking forward to your book and other talks and other explorations.